we pray that the things we do and say will be in keeping with your will, Father. We ask you to be with each and every one that is here and those that are coming. We pray that those that are not here, Father, will in the next opportunity that they have, put more effort to be on time. We ask you to be with some things that we do. We pray that we'll always strive to do those things which are pleasing unto you. We ask you to forgive us our sins in Jesus' name. Amen.
Morning.
Morning.
Has everybody got a book? Someone need a book? Yeah. All right, we are on lesson number 6, beginning on page 58. The title of this lesson is The Last Plague. If you remember from last week, we were on the first plague. And so there's a lot of good information that I guess we just a little sort of skipped over, but we don't want to just completely skip over it. Do you remember what the first plague was?
Snake.
Well, that was the first sign. The rod was thrown down, turned the snake and whatnot. The first plague was he turned the water into blood. Now in chapter 8 we have plagues number 2, 3, and 4. Do you remember what the second plague was?
Frogs.
We're going to work on it. Okay. Frog. Now, we didn't study that, but maybe we've probably done this a million times over the years. Moses, he goes back to Pharaoh, and after he turned the water into the blood, I almost said wine, because that's what Jesus did. After he turned the water into blood, the Pharaoh's magicians, they didn't turn all the water into blood because they'd already turned it into blood, but evidently they did something. And he said, see, hey, abracadabra. And so they did a little trick, and Pharaoh hardened his heart, and he wouldn't relent. So he goes back to Pharaoh, Moses goes back to Pharaoh, and with the same, the Lord has said to let my people go, and God says let the people go, and he won't let them go, so he strikes the rivers, and out comes all these frogs. And when these frogs come out, it's not just 10 or 15 frogs. Frogs are everywhere. They're in people's houses. They're in the ovens, and I don't think they're ovens like what we're thinking about, but they're in their ovens, and they're in their beds, in their bed chambers, in their beds. I mean, imagine that, pulling back the covers, and there's just frogs, just all over the place. You just frogs everywhere, and these might be some of these. They might be little frogs, big frogs, everything in between, but probably lots of toads and everything. But just imagine that. So Pharaoh, Pharaoh wants him to get rid of the frogs, and also the magicians, they do a little trick with the frogs too, and somehow they're able to produce some frogs. And so the frogs don't get his attention enough to let him go. So the next thing we have was, you remember? Lice. He turns the dust. Moses, he turns God does through Moses. He turns the dust into lice, and lice are everywhere. You ever been out when the gnats are just terrible, and you just can't hardly. I mean, I'd rather mosquitoes than gnats. They get into your head, and they start. The skin so soft seems to work a little bit, but gnats they eat everything, they drink everything, and gnats are just a mess. And these. I know it says lice, but can you imagine just lice everywhere? And so Pharaoh, he says, "Oh look, I'll let you go. Just ask God to get rid of the lice, and I'll let you go." Well, he's lying, right? Because as soon as he gets rid of the lice, then he sees, well, the lice are going, so he relents and he hardens his heart. So the next thing to happen is what? so there's just flies everywhere. And so he wants that, he asked, just ask the Lord to get rid of those. And, and I'll let you go, and of course he's lying again. So, in chapter 9, then the next thing to come along is what?
There's your locust,
There's a pestilence on
the
the
livestock.
cattle.
The livestock, yeah.
And again, there's a distinction made between the livestock of the Egyptians and those living, the Israelites in Goshen.
So we're to assume then that the children of Israel before the flies was dealing with the other?
You know what? I asked the same question myself, and I wasn't too worried about it to the point where I said, let me dig into this. So I did dig into it. But yeah, that question is in the back of my mind. I wonder if did the Israelites, when the water was turned to blood, their source of water would have been the same source as the rest of Egypt.
Right.
And so when the water of the Nile was all changed and turned into water, they had to go digging in the ground to find water. And was there a distinction made between Israel and the rest of Egypt?
Fly,
Pardon me?
plague of fly.
Yeah, the Bible does, when it gets to the plague of flies, we see that there is a distinction
This
made.
is the only one, this is the first plague that affected only Egyptians.
Yeah, and I think that's the case. Just from a straightforward reading of the passage, like you said there, that's where he says, hey, I'm going to make a distinction between and he's making that distinction to show you, hey, look, this is me doing this. This is God doing this.
I have a question.
Yes.
It's a dumb question, but
No question is a dumb question.
each plague, was it for one whole day? Was it for a week? Was it for, how long did each plague last?
That's a good question. I did not look up that answer or make a note of it in my mind. Does anybody have an idea right off the top of their head?
Well, one day of frost would be enough for me, but, all the lights or any of
I know the water was turned to blood. I think it said for a week, didn't it? If I remember correctly.
7 days
7
passed
days.
from the frogs, yeah. 7 days passed after the Lord struck the Nile.
Yeah,
Then the frog came, and then the next verse in 10, it says tomorrow.
yeah.
So that was like 1 day.
So at least we know that at least in one case that there was a week, and we know at least in one case that that the next day something else happened. So did these things happen in quick succession, one right after the other, probably? But like you said, one day dealing with all them frogs in the bed and everything, and you're going to be going, or lice or whatever, and you're going to. I think a day of lice like that would feel like an eternity. Pardon me?
I don't think it would take a whole day to feel like that.
Oh, no. You'd be pulling your hair.
When you can't get something off your skin, can you imagine?
No. Next, after the cattle are struck in chapter 9, what do we have? Boils. Imagine being covered with boils. All the Egyptians, from Pharaoh on down, except for Israel now. You're just covered in these boils and everything. And I don't know if anybody's ever had a boil.
I have, they hurt
It hurts.
a lot.
I've had sores. I've had a sore on me that's, sore. I don't know if it's a boil. I don't think it's a boil, but I've had a sore. And you know how a sore can feel.
But did you pick it?
Oh.
Every kid has picked a sore.
Oh, that's what I'm talking about.
Every kid has picked a sore. So it takes a little longer to heal. But anyhow, they're covered with boils. After the boils, we have hail. And this is hail like, nothing else, right? We've had hail that's damaged rooftops, and you've had to get shingles replaced. We've had hail that has damaged cars.
Yeah.
And if the hail is big enough, you can get it, right? But this hail These, Moses stretched out his the rod and as he was instructed by God, right? It caused, was it east wind to blow? And they just blew in the swarms of locusts. It just blew in, and they just gobbled up everything. Pharaoh, same thing. They ate up everything that was left from the hail. That's exactly right. And like before, he I'll let you go. Just get rid of these locusts. And so he entreats the Lord. Moses asked the Lord to get rid of the locusts, and so the west wind blows them all away and blows them into the Red Sea. And there's not a single locust left after that. When God does something, he does it completely, right? And then after the locusts, what do we have? Darkness. Darkness, I think, and the Bible describes darkness like you can feel. Anybody ever been to, what is that place in Tennessee? It's a cave that you go way down. Ruby Falls. Lost Sea. I've never been that one. I've been to Ruby Falls. You ever been to Ruby Falls?
Yeah. Actually, listen how dark it gets in Lost Sea.
You ever been to a cave when they turn out the lights? Okay, don't move. Hold hands. Hold the rail. And they turn off the lights in that cave, and you can feel the dark. You literally can. It's like you can almost feel like it's like a presence. It's so dark, and you can do this, and nothing. It is so dark. Imagine it being that dark. However, it wasn't dark in while it was dark there, it wasn't dark in Goshen. Dark all over the place, except for in Goshen. Oh, they got spiders that glow, yeah.
Yeah, when you turn the lights on, you see the spiders.
Yeah.
They glow.
So that's the first 9 plagues, and you read about those in chapter 7, Exodus chapter 7 through all the way through chapter 10. And this morning now we are in the last plague, Exodus 11 verses 1 to 10. Somebody read our scriptures, passages.
And the Lord said to Moses, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. Afterward, he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will surely drive you out of here altogether. Speak now in the hearing of the people, and let every man ask from his neighbor, and every woman from her neighbor, articles of silver and articles of gold. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, and in the sight of the people. Then Moses said, Thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the female servant, who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the animals. Then there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as was not like it before, nor shall be like it again. But against none of the children of Israel shall a dog move its tongue against man or beast, that you may know that the Lord does make a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. And all these your servants shall come down to me and bow down to me, saying, Get out, and all the people will follow you. After that I will go out. Then he went out from Pharaoh in great anger. But the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will not heed you, so that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. So Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the children of Israel go out of his land.
Imagine the crying and the suffering that night. You could feel for these Egyptian mothers and fathers as one by one by one by one, their firstborn is dropping dead. Can you imagine that? And the crying and the wailing and from the lowliest Egyptian to the Pharaoh himself. And not only that, even the firstborn of every animal, of every beast. You know, Mr. and Mrs. Cow, Mr. and Mrs. Hog, you know, their firstborn son is dropping dead. And I'm not suggesting that Mr. and Mrs. Cow was crying, but can you imagine? And yet, I'm going to get to you. At the same time, while all that's going on in Israel, you don't have so much as a dog yelping or barking at a person. Normally, normally you can't walk by a fence. Some of you person's got a dog in their backyard, and you walk down the street. My dogs do the same stupid thing. I said, would you let people walk in peace? They think they got to bark at every single person that walks by the front door. They can be on the other side of the street, and they got to bark at them. I feel like getting one of those shock collars, because it drives me nuts. But in Israel, yes, ma'am.
Well, didn't the same thing happen to the Israelites while they were killing the first some of those children?
Oh, yeah.
They were suffering that same fate.
Right.
It's about to happen to them.
It's the same fate. Same fate. All right, in the introduction. Questions or comments before we move on? In the introduction, he says, before God afflicted the Egyptians with the 10 plagues, Moses addressed Pharaoh and revealed God's intent. Speaking for God, he declared, by this you shall know that I am the Lord, Exodus 7:17. What did Pharaoh say to Moses? When Moses first said, look, God said to let my people go, let us go into the desert. Was it 3 days journey that we may sacrifice unto the Lord? Who is God that I should, and don't think, this is not like Paul when he was in Athens. In Acts chapter 17, Paul is going through Athens, right? And he noticed that these people are so superstitious. They have an idol for every god under the earth, every god that they can think of under the sun. And then just to make sure that they didn't offend somebody or leave some god out, they erected an idol with the inscription to an unknown God. Oh, you can't fault us for hurting your feelings, Mr. Unknown God, because we made you an idol. And so Paul says, let me tell you about this unknown God. Not that he was unknown, but he was unknown to them. I'll tell you about the unknown God, the God who created heaven and earth.
But in Pharaoh's comment, it was not.
Oh, no. Pharaoh's comment was, God says, let my people go. Who is God that I need to? Who is God that I need to obey Him? Who is God that I need to obey Him? That's Pharaoh, and he's fixing to get a 10-course lesson on who God is, and that's his intent here. He is going to demonstrate. I'm going to show you exactly who I am. And everything, anything under the sun that the pharaohs trusted in or exalted as a god, he's gonna show his authority over each and every one of them. I'll show you who I am. You want to know who God is? Watch. Although the first plague affected the Egyptians, it did not teach Pharaoh the lesson God wanted him to learn. I think it was teaching him the whole time. But here's the reason he says this. For Pharaoh refused to release the Israelites. Instead, Pharaoh's heart grew hard, and he did not heed them as the Lord had said. Moses shouldn't have been surprised. God had already told him that, this was going to happen. And God certainly wasn't surprised. And Pharaoh turned and went into his house. Neither was his heart moved by this. This is in chapter 7, verses 22 to 23. The second plague had somewhat different effect. Despite his magician's ability to use their enchantments to bring frogs on the land of Egypt, Exodus 8:7, Pharaoh petitioned Moses and Aaron for relief by saying, entreat the Lord that he may take away the frogs from me and from my people. I think he's starting to learn a lesson a little bit here. Okay, maybe this God is who you say he is. So go ask God. Go ask the Lord to take away the frogs.
Or is this just a ploy on his part?
Well, I'm sure there's some of that going on. I'm sure there's some recognition, and I think there is he wants the frogs gone. This is a burden on him and his people. And I mean, just like we said before, I mean, imagine frogs. You open the oven to bake some bread, and out come frogs. And then there's frogs, maybe just sitting on drooling all over the bread, and then you try to crawl in bed, and you're sleeping on a mattress full of frogs. And he wanted the frogs gone. Is that giving you the willies? Frogs. I hate it when at nighttime, the little green ones, they hop on your door, and then you open your door and they hop in. I hate that. Sarah had one do that in her house, and she calls me. Brandon was working at night. He was on the night shift, and so she calls me. I said, Sarah, I said, look, you got to get yourself a fly swatter or a broom. No, come here and help me. There's frogs in the house. I said, no, look, you can't be calling me at 9 o'clock every time you get a bug in the house. So I relented. Yes, I went and got the frog. Because my wife is on the other side of the couch saying, go get that frog, go get that frog. So it took me 15 minutes to find the frog.
You're a good dad.
Either that or I'm just stupid or something. Where was I? Entreat the Lord that he may take away the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go. He's lying. Or maybe he didn't intend to lie. Maybe at that moment in his mind, he said, I'm going to let the people go because I got to get rid of these frogs. But whatever the case was, when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and did not heed, as the Lord had said. You ever heard the expression, you're a glutton for punishment? You ever been a glutton for punishment? I have. Stubbornness will do that to you. Unlike the first two plagues, the Egyptian magicians were unable to reproduce the third plague, the plague of lice. Consequently, they said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. The magicians are starting, whether or not Pharaoh's starting to realize it, the magicians are starting to recognize something. They know what tricks they can do and can't do. And when somebody starts, it's just like, Simon the sorcerer. Simon the sorcerer, he's tricking everybody thinking that, hey, he's got some power. He's got the power of God. But now he sees what the apostles can do. And he says, whoa, wait a minute. I want this. I want to be a part of that because he recognizes what the genuine from the trick or, whatever the case might be. And the magicians here, they see, hey, this is truly the finger of God. Yes?
We have all dealt with our kids with lice in the hair in schools, But think about it in this respect. This is lice covering you.
They're just all over on everybody.
All over, everywhere. This just ain't in the hair. This is just covered, and it's all over everything around you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These sort of things are things that just no one's ever seen anything like it. Consequently, they said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. Even so, their testimony had little effect on the king of Egypt, who stubbornly refused to heed God's demand and released the Israelites from bondage. Therefore, the plagues continued. Until the sixth plague, this is something interesting, he says. Until the sixth plague, the text declares Pharaoh hardened his own heart and merely possessed a heart that grew hard. From the sixth plague onward, the Lord's involvement in the hardening of Pharaoh's heart is stressed. Following the plague of boils, the text states, but the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not heed them, just as the Lord had spoken to Moses, verse 12. It's almost like he's saying that, Pharaoh was responsible for hardening his heart, for the first few plagues, but then after that, then God was responsible for it in his heart. Now, I don't know if that's what the author's saying here, but I don't buy it. There's not a single person in the world that's going to stand before God and point the finger of blame at God. Why didn't you do so and so? Why'd you do so and so? Why didn't you do so and so? Well, God, it was your fault. You hardened my heart. I don't think Pharaoh's ever going to be able to do that. Now, if he means by this that God could have gone. Why didn't God go straight to the 10th plague? God could have shook him right then and there. But God did this thing in the way that God decided he wanted to do this thing. And and it could very well be that God did things, knowing what was going to happen. God did things exactly the way he did it, knowing that he was going to harden his heart. He hardened his heart because of what God was doing, not because God was making him,
God knew that he was going to go against it, but God also realized and said, I'm going to make it to where, you're going to even suffer more because of your heart.
So anyhow, I don't know if that's what the author is saying or not. Like I've said before.
That's not what the author said.
No, right. But he did. But did he harden his heart by miraculously making him have a hard heart so that he had no choice in the matter? Or did he harden his heart by what he was doing? And as we see here, when it says that he was stubborn and that he refused to let the people go, he was deciding himself what he was going to do and not do. This is Pharaoh, God telling Pharaoh what to do, and Pharaoh saying, no, I'm not going to do what you want. I'm going to do my will. And his heart was hardened because of that.
I tended to, like in Romans chapter 1, when the wrath of God was against mankind, it says that because they knew God, they glorified him not, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And then verse 24 says, wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their
Yes.
life. So
Yeah.
there's a point where
God will give you up. He'll let you do.
continuing.
He'll let you, if that's the route you, and that's a good point right there. And that's probably what I'm trying to say here. If you're going to be stubborn and that's what you're going to do, okay, buddy, he's going to let you do it, but you're going to suffer the consequence for it too.
But didn't God tell Moses that,
Well, he knew it was gonna happen.
but I know all that, but didn't God tell Moses that he was going to harden Pharaoh's heart?
Yes, but he told Moses that he would harden his heart, that Pharaoh would harden his heart. But it's not to say that if I come to you and I say, I'm Moses, and I say, God has said, let my people go. Who is God to say my people, let my people go? Who is God? I'm Pharaoh, don't you know that? I'm Butch. Who are you telling me, right? And I said, no, let me tell you who God is. And I show you who God is, and you get mad, you harden your heart. There is a sense in which I've hardened your heart because I'm sitting here telling you what my will is, and you're hardening your heart, and you say, no, I'm going to show you what my will is. And the question is, am I forcing you? Am I making it impossible for you to obey?
But it is not.
The Bible says that God cannot be tempted by sin, nor does he tempt. God will not make you sin. He won't do it. And if he did, if God made you sin, then you could sit there and then say, look, I sinned, but you made me do it. But there's nobody going to stand before God. No one ever going to stand before God and say, God, it's your fault.
But you know when,
Some might try that.
Some might try it, but that ain't going to fly, is it? Yes, sir.
but you know when I was just.
Yes.
Just give me a chance to finish this thought, James. You know when when Jesus was dealing with Peter, and Peter had went astray, but Jesus told Peter what he was going to do, told him when he was going to recognize what he was going to do, and told him when he
Right.
You know, so he has told Peter his whole story of what's going to happen in Peter's life. So Jesus knew that.
He knew ahead of time. That's
Okay.
right.
God
He knew ahead of time. Right.
What Pharaoh was going to do.
Right.
And so the thing, I know we're trying to have discussions
Sure.
back and forth, but when the Bible says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, that's exactly what he did. Now, all we learning is the story and how it took place. But God said that Pharaoh was going to be used as an example to show his power. And exactly what took place, it did that.
Right. He hardened his heart in the sense that God told you, God said, Pharaoh, this is what you're going to do. And Pharaoh said, nope, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. And so in that sense, he hardened his heart. Had God just kept his mouth shut and not said anything to Pharaoh and said, Pharaoh, look, you keep treat Israel how you want to. He and Pharaoh would have got along perfectly fine. But God hardened his heart. Why? Because God started inserting his will over Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said, who are you? See?
God knew Pharaoh's personality. God knew.
Let me ask you a question. Did Pharaoh have, when God said, look, you do something, did Pharaoh have it within his ability to obey or not obey?
Yes, he did. He had his ability one way or the other.
If God would have said, hey, look, I'm not going to let you obey. I'm going to miraculously cause it to where I'm going to ask you to do something. Anthony, I want you to get up from there and go sit right here. But I'm going to put 100 pounds of weight and tie you around that bench right there, and which is not going to allow you to get up and obey me. And now I'm going to turn around and judge you for not obeying me by getting up and going over here. See?
The King James in 14 says, the Lord said unto Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hard. He refused to let. The NIV says, the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is unyielding. Still upon Pharaoh, his heart,
Right.
unyielding, continuously.
Right.
God gave him up.
Right. And that's the only point I'm trying to make here. At the end of the day, however we look at this, at the end of the day, Pharaoh is not going to have the right to accuse God. Pharaoh is not going to stand before God and say, hey, it's your fault that all this happened. Yes, sir.
It may not have nothing to do with it, but when I finished reading John, the part where it says, and Satan entered Judas's heart. God didn't force Satan to enter Judas, but he knew it was going to happen. Same thing could have been here. Who knows if Satan's not tempting?
You know what? That's a good point. Jesus had just told, Jesus sitting there, he's dining with the apostles, and he's right there, and he's looking Judas in the eye. He said that one of you is going to betray me, and is it me? Is it me? Is it me? Another one who dips with me. Or however that's worded, right? And Judas is right there.
He said the one that dipped with the bread.
Right. But, yes, ma'am.
What did call you reference?
What verse is that you referenced?
That was in Romans chapter 2.
Romans chapter 2.
That's actually Romans chapter 1, excuse me. 1:21 through 24.
And then the second time you referenced.
That was in Exodus.
Oh, okay.
That was in Exodus. Exodus.
All right, so anyway, he says, whether or not Pharaoh was ready to give in to God's demands, God was not ready. He intended to multiply his signs and his wonders in the land of Egypt. 6 plagues were evidently not enough to make his name widely known in all the earth. 4 more were needed. God could have went directly for the knockout punch, right? But he didn't. I mean, he jabbed a little bit. He jabbed a little bit, and then finally, he threw a left cross and hit him with that big right hand, and went by the 10th plague. Then we have the knockout punch.
There's something we need to look at here too, Scott. These plagues didn't affect just Pharaoh. Okay? It affected the whole land of Egypt.
Oh, yeah.
So the Egyptians are now learning,
The world is learning.
And
Yeah.
And where does Pharaoh stand in God's sight?
Egypt is the mightiest nation on earth at this point in time in history.
So, we gotta realize that God is not only teaching Pharaoh, he's teaching Egypt.
Every last one of Egypt's enemies can eventually sees what's happening. I mean, eventually he's going to lose his whole army. They're going to get buried at sea.
When they finally get to the land of Canaan, they already said, we heard of what happened.
Oh, absolutely. People had heard about this and knew about it. And so when they entered the land, and this is 40 years later, when they cross over in the Red Sea, and you know, they first came to, you know, when they went out, the 10 spies go out to spy out the land, 8 of the spies are too afraid. Oh, there's giants, and there's this and that, and everything, and there's no way we can do this. God had just led them out of Egypt with a mighty hand. We can't do this. What do you mean we can't do that? You couldn't leave Egypt for 400 years. And I just, what do you mean you can't do this? 2 of them wanted to do it. 2 of them, Caleb and Joshua. But 8 of them were too afraid and made too many excuses. And so it was 40 years later before they go into the land. And when they did finally go in, the people they were afraid. We've heard about what you did. Arguably, the best known of the 10 plagues is the final one, the death of the firstborn. God told Moses this plague would precipitate Israel's release, Exodus 11:1. Yet when Moses announced the plague to Pharaoh, Moses left his presence in great anger. Why?
Because Pharaoh rejected him again, and Moses knew what was coming.
Yeah, I think what Garrett explains here, I think makes a lot of sense. I don't think Moses. I don't think Moses relished in what was fixing to happen.
No.
You might think, man, these guys have been our enemies. Look what they've been doing to us for the last 400 years. The way they've been treating us. They've killed our babies. They've done this. They've done that. They're beating us. They're making us They're making us go out and get our own straw now and still make the same amount of bricks and look at all this. All right, go get them, God.
Well, another thing, like you said, as you read Garrett's explanation here, you got to remember, Moses was 40 years old when he left.
Yes.
He was raised. He had a love for these people. Moses loved the Egyptians, and he was a king to the Egyptians and that and everything. And as he goes, he doesn't want to see all these people who are going to be killed, who are going to die because of Pharaoh's rejection.
It says here, Garrett explained the only reasonable objection of his object of his anger is Pharaoh. He's mad at Pharaoh. And the best explanation for Moses' anger is that he considered the deaths of so many Egyptian men and boys to be needless tragedy. And it was needless, yes.
Why did they just say men and boys?
Because your firstborn, your firstborn might be you might be an elderly couple. You might be an 80-year-old man, 87-year-old
Right,
man.
I agree with that.
You might be an 87-year-old man.
Only men or boys were firstborn.
Right, but he might be an 87-year-old man, but he might be the firstborn.
Right, I agree. But why just men?
And I'm not picking on you, but I think you might be the oldest one in here right now.
Women were probably.
I'm sure some women were firstborn also.
Yes.
They're females.
Just goes to the history, they really didn't follow the.
Yeah, but it was the firstborn son, not firstborn.
It didn't say that. It don't say firstborn son. The firstborn.
It says firstborn.
It says
Okay, well,
firstborn.
look, I'll have to go back and check that, and you may be right. I had always assumed maybe I'm operating in my mind off an assumption that it was firstborn son. But maybe it's just plain on for firstborn.
And that's why when I read that, I
So
said, why
so
did
who
you just did it?
raise your hand if you're the oldest lady in here? No, I'm not going to make you do that. I'm not going to do that. But she might be the firstborn, right?
It says, the firstborn of the female servant who's behind the handmill.
Okay.
And all the firstborn of animals.
Yeah, I was just, then in my mind, I was going off the assumption, firstborn son. And I guess that's because normally when you're reading through firstborn son, it's a lot of times women are not, unless something prominent happened, I think, unless this lady has done something that's prominent and it's prominent to the narrative, women aren't talked a lot about. Adam and Eve, start in the very beginning. Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel. And then Seth is born when Adam is, 106?